The choke point has been closed. In a move that military analysts have dreaded for decades and diplomats swore could never happen, the Strait of Hormuz went silent at dawn. The steady thrum of oil tankers, the lifeblood of the global economy, was replaced by an eerie stillness as the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, in a coordinated and brazen operation, seized or disabled multiple commercial vessels, effectively corking the narrow passageway that connects the Persian Gulf to the open ocean. Initial reports, still fragmentary and chaotic, indicate that United States naval personnel attached to a Bahrain-based patrol squadron were among those engaged in the initial confrontation, with unofficial channels citing casualties. The world woke up to a different reality. The fulcrum of global energy security has been violently tilted. The immediate human toll, still unconfirmed by Pentagon spokespersons but whispered by sources in Gulf capitals, involves American advisors present on a commercial ship targeted by IRGC fast attack craft. The images are not yet cleared for broadcast, but the descriptions filtering through diplomatic cables speak of a swift, overwhelming assault designed not just to blockade, but to send a message. This was not a warning shot. It was a seizure of sovereignty over a global waterway. As oil futures briefly became untradeable on Asian markets this morning, the world is left staring into the abyss of an energy crisis that could dwarf the shocks of 1973. The question no longer seems to be if a major power confrontation will occur in the Gulf, but rather how extensive the first salvos will be. To understand the gravity of this moment, one must first understand the strait itself. This narrow maritime passage, at its most constricted point, just 21 miles wide, is the only maritime route from the Persian Gulf to the open ocean. For the world's industrialized economies, it is an artery that cannot be blocked. Nearly a fifth of the world's total petroleum consumption, roughly 20 million barrels of crude oil and condensate per day, flows through this channel. This isn't just oil for gasoline. It's the feedstock for plastics, pharmaceuticals, and the lifeblood of transportation networks from Tokyo to Rotterdam. Closing it is not an act of war in the conventional sense. It is an act of economic strangulation directed at every nation that depends on the free flow of energy. The strait's strategic importance has always been defined by its geography. The Gulf of Oman feeds into it, and the waters narrow to separate the Iranian coast from the Musandam Peninsula, an exclave of Oman. This means the shipping lanes, divided into inbound and outbound traffic, run extremely close to Iranian territorial waters. For decades, this proximity has been a source of tension, a game of cat and mouse where IRGC vessels would harass passing tankers, only to back down when Western warships appeared. But the fundamental truth of naval warfare in this region has always been asymmetric. While the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet in Bahrain possesses overwhelming firepower, the IRGC operates fast, agile swarms of boats, sea mines, and anti-ship missiles that hug the coastline. They have always planned for this scenario. The historical context of this shutdown is steeped in the bitter rivalry between Tehran and Washington. Since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, the United States has viewed the Islamic Republic as the primary destabilizing force in the Middle East. The tensions have ebbed and flowed, from the tanker war of the 1980s, where the U.S. Navy reflagged Kuwaiti tankers to protect them from Iranian attacks, to the more recent shadow war of cyber attacks and sabotage. The Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign, which reimposed crippling sanctions and assassinated General Qasem Soleimani in 2020, pushed the conflict from the shadows toward the brink. Each escalation hardened the Iranian position, convincing the hardliners in Tehran that their survival depends on possessing leverage over the global economy. Inside the corridors of power in Tehran, the decision to close the strait would not have been taken lightly. It represents a strategic gamble of the highest order, one that likely emerged from intense debate between the regime's political leadership and the IRGC. Sources with knowledge of Iranian strategic thinking suggest this move is born from a position of perceived weakness, not strength. With its economy battered by sanctions, its proxies under pressure in the region, and its nuclear program under constant scrutiny, the leadership may have calculated that only an act of such profound disruption could force the world to renegotiate the terms of its isolation. They are betting that the economic pain inflicted on China, India, and Europe will quickly translate into political pressure on Washington to concede. For the United States and its allies, the situation presents a nightmare of escalation management. The initial reports of American personnel hurt complicates any path to de-escalation. The Pentagon's options, as outlined in countless war games, range from the dangerous to the catastrophic. A limited strike to clear a path through the strait, known as clearing operations, would involve sweeping mines and engaging IRGC coastal defense batteries, a process that could take weeks under fire. A broader campaign to degrade the IRGC's naval capacity would be seen in Tehran as an attempt at regime change, likely triggering a wider regional war involving Iranian proxies in Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and Lebanon. The global oil market's reaction has been one of sheer panic, though the true shock is yet to be felt. Traders are not just pricing in the loss of Iranian oil, which has been largely off the market due to sanctions, but the loss of Saudi, Emirati, Kuwaiti, and Iraqi crude. With the strait closed, nearly 20 million barrels per day are trapped in the Gulf. Strategic petroleum reserves held by consumer nations are the first line of defense. The United States and its IEA partners will likely announce a coordinated release of emergency stocks within hours. But these reserves are designed to bridge supply gaps caused by hurricanes or minor outages, not to replace the output of an entire region for an indefinite period. Analysts are now recalibrating their economic models in real time, and the projections are terrifying. Brent crude, which was trading at relatively stable levels just 24 hours ago, is now facing a price discovery mechanism that is essentially broken. We are looking at a potential spike well beyond 150, 200, or even higher per barrel, levels that would instantly trigger a global recession. The impact on inflation, already stubbornly high in many Western economies, would be devastating. Central banks, which have been fighting inflation with interest rate hikes, would face an impossible choice: raise rates further to combat energy-driven inflation and crush growth, or stand by and watch consumer prices spiral out of control. The geopolitical fault lines are already cracking. China, the world's largest oil importer and a major customer of Iran, finds itself in an excruciating position. Beijing has long called for stability in the Gulf while maintaining strong economic and strategic ties with Tehran. Now its primary energy supply route is severed. While China has a naval base in Djibouti and has spoken of protecting its interests, it lacks the blue water Navy projection capability to forcibly reopen the strait. This crisis will test the very foundation of the burgeoning Sino-Iranian relationship. Will Beijing use its considerable diplomatic and economic leverage to pressure Tehran, or will it stand aside and watch its Western rivals bleed? In Europe, the crisis is resurrecting old ghosts of energy dependency. Having spent the last 2 years weaning itself off Russian gas following the invasion of Ukraine, Europe now faces a new energy stranglehold from the opposite direction. The closure of the strait cuts off a significant portion of the seaborne trade that feeds European refineries. This comes at the worst possible time as winter approaches and governments are already struggling with high energy costs. The political cohesion of the European Union, already tested by the war in Ukraine, will be stretched to its breaking point as member states scramble to secure their own national supplies, potentially triggering a beggar-thy-neighbor dynamic within the single market. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, Iran's regional rivals, are now in the direct line of fire. Their vast oil export infrastructure sits on the wrong side of the blockade. For years, they have built pipelines to the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean coast to bypass the Strait of Hormuz, but these alternative routes have limited capacity. The bulk of their exports, the revenue that funds their ambitious economic transformation projects, is now locked behind an Iranian naval cordon. Riyadh faces a terrible calculus. Does it call for immediate U.S. military intervention to reopen the strait, risking a war on its doorstep? Or does it attempt a dangerous diplomatic outreach to Tehran to secure the passage of its own tankers, effectively legitimizing Iran's control over the waterway? Inside the White House Situation Room, the president is being presented with options that all carry immense risk. The national security team is split, as they often are in such crises. The military advisors, particularly from Central Command, are urging a swift and decisive show of force to reestablish freedom of navigation, arguing that any hesitation will be interpreted as weakness by Tehran and further erode American deterrence globally. Conversely, the State Department and intelligence community are warning of the long-term consequences, the certainty of Iranian retaliation through its proxies, and the potential for the conflict to draw in other great powers. The presence of American casualties adds a visceral political dimension to the debate that cannot be ignored. The IRGC's tactics in the initial seizure reveal a high degree of planning and operational security. According to maritime security sources, the operation began with a cyber component, potentially jamming communications and GPS signals in the strait, creating confusion among commercial shipping. This was followed by the deployment of fast boats and naval commandos who boarded vessels with speed and precision. The targeting of a ship with U.S. personnel aboard suggests either exquisite intelligence on force movements or a deliberate provocation to test the American response. This is the strategy of the weaker power, forcing the stronger power into a reactive posture where every move is fraught with the risk of over-escalation. We are now hearing from retired generals and admirals who have spent their careers studying this exact scenario. Their consensus is grim. There are no good options, one former U.S. Central Command commander told our team, speaking on condition of anonymity. If we go in hard, we own the problem. We will have to establish a naval dominance that requires resources we don't have without stripping other theaters. If we do nothing, we signal to every other actor with a grudge that choking global trade is a viable tool of statecraft. The era of free and open sea lanes may be ending. His words underscore the terrifying novelty of this situation. The world's superpower is being challenged on the seas by a regional power with a knife to the throat of the global economy. The concept of security of the seas, a bedrock principle of the post-World War II order, is being shredded in real time. For decades, the United States Navy has acted as the guarantor of global maritime commerce, a role that has benefited all nations, including rivals. This action by Iran directly challenges that hegemony. If the U.S. and its allies cannot quickly and effectively reopen the Strait of Hormuz, it will send a signal to other nations with claims over strategic waterways, from the South China Sea to the Malacca Strait, that the American security umbrella is no longer reliable. The ripple effects of this crisis will be felt in every geopolitical hotspot where freedom of navigation is contested. From the perspective of the Iranian people, this is a moment of profound anxiety. The regime in Tehran has mastered the art of survival through crisis, often using external threats to consolidate internal control. But a war with the United States is not a manageable crisis. It is an existential threat. The streets of Tehran, which have seen waves of protest against the regime's repression and economic mismanagement, are now quiet, a silence born of fear and uncertainty. The state-controlled media is already framing the closure as a heroic act of resistance against American bullying, but the reality for ordinary Iranians is that they will bear the brunt of the retaliatory strikes and the economic devastation that follows. The energy industry itself is grappling with unprecedented logistical challenges. Insurance for vessels operating in the Gulf region has become effectively unavailable or astronomically priced. The few tanker owners willing to risk the transit are demanding war risk bonuses that make their voyages economically unviable. The global fleet of very large crude carriers is being rerouted, but there is no alternate route for the oil trapped inside the Gulf. The only option is to load it onto trucks and pipelines, a fraction of the volume needed. This logistical paralysis means that even if the strait were to reopen tomorrow, it would take weeks for the supply chain to resume its normal rhythm. In the oil trading hubs of London, Singapore, and Houston, the mood is apocalyptic. Veteran traders who lived through the Gulf War, the 2008 financial crisis, and the COVID-19 demand collapse say they have never seen anything like this. The market is not just trading on fundamentals, it is trading on fear, rumor, and the lack of information. The closure represents a physical supply shock that is absolute and instantaneous. Unlike a refinery outage or a pipeline rupture, which can be fixed, reopening the strait requires a political and military solution that is simply not yet on the horizon. The paper market for oil is decoupled from reality, with prices quoted that bear no relation to actual transactions. The role of the United Nations and international law is now under the spotlight. The closure of international straits is a violation of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which guarantees the right of transit passage. The Security Council is likely to convene an emergency session, but any meaningful resolution is almost certain to be vetoed by Russia or China. Moscow, seeing an opportunity to distract from its own war in Ukraine, may offer rhetorical support to Iran, complicating any unified international response. This diplomatic paralysis at the UN will only reinforce the perception that international law is powerless in the face of military facts on the ground. As we look toward the coming hours and days, the world watches the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet. Its flagship, the USS Lewis B. Puller, an expeditionary sea base, and its accompanying destroyers are surely moving into position. The question is not whether they have the capability to engage the IRGC, but whether the order will come. The White House is likely waiting for a clearer picture of the situation, including the status of the injured American personnel and the fate of the seized vessels. In the absence of clear orders, the commanders on the ground must prepare for every eventuality, from a defensive posture to an active engagement to break the blockade. Iranian state television has begun broadcasting triumphant images of the operation, showing IRGC speedboats patrolling near anchored tankers. The narrative being spun in Tehran is one of national pride and defiance against the global arrogance of the West. This propaganda victory is crucial for the regime, which needs to rally its population and the wider Shia world behind its cause. They are portraying the closure not as an act of war, but as the exercise of Iran's sovereign right to control its own coastline and respond to decades of hostility. This messaging is designed for domestic consumption, but it also resonates in parts of the global South where anti-American sentiment runs deep. The immediate future hinges on the fate of the commercial vessels and their crews. Are they hostages, bargaining chips, or simply detained vessels in a disputed waterway? If the IRGC attempts to move the ships to an Iranian port, the crisis escalates further. If they hold them in place, they create a floating barrier. The crews, a mix of nationalities likely including Filipinos, Indians, and Europeans, are now pawns in a geopolitical game with no clear rules. Their safety is paramount, but in the fog of this crisis, their plight risks being overshadowed by the larger strategic concerns of the nations involved. The impact on global supply chains, already fragile after the pandemic, will be catastrophic and immediate. Beyond oil, the Gulf region exports petrochemicals, aluminum, and other essential industrial materials. Factories in Asia and Europe that rely on just-in-time deliveries of these feedstocks will begin shutting down within days. The cost of shipping anything, anywhere will skyrocket as insurance premiums surge and vessels are forced to take longer, safer routes. This is not just an oil crisis, it is a crisis of globalized trade itself. The intricate web of commerce that defines the 21st century economy is being torn at its most vital node. We must also consider the possibility of miscalculation. In the tense hours ahead, a single IRGC commander on a speedboat could misinterpret a movement by a U.S. warship, or a U.S. pilot under pressure could strike a target believed to be preparing a missile launch. The fog of war is thickest in confined waters. Both sides have established rules of engagement and communication channels, including the deconfliction line set up after the Soleimani assassination, but those channels were designed for incidents, not for a full-blown blockade. In the heat of the moment, a spark is all it would take to transform a crisis into a conflagration. The global community, from Brussels to Beijing to Brasilia, is scrambling to find a diplomatic off-ramp. Back-channel communications are buzzing. Oman, which has long acted as an intermediary between Washington and Tehran, is likely the key player in these efforts. The Sultanate maintains good relations with both sides and shares control of the Strait's entrance. Qatari mediators may also be involved. The goal of any diplomatic push would be to find a formula that allows Iran to claim a victory, perhaps a guarantee of sanctions relief or a commitment to talks in exchange for reopening the waterway and releasing the vessels. But with American blood potentially spilled, the political space for such a deal in Washington is virtually non-existent. The next 48 hours will define the character of the 21st century. Will we witness a return to great power gunboat diplomacy, where the strongest navy simply forces its way through? Or will we see the emergence of a new, more dangerous world where strategic choke points become permanent zones of conflict held hostage by regional powers armed with asymmetric capabilities? The closure of the Strait of Hormuz is not merely a news event, it is a historical pivot. The decisions made in the war rooms of Washington and Tehran will echo for generations, determining whether the global order can adapt to new threats or whether it will fracture under the pressure. As night falls over the Gulf, the lights of the stranded tankers twinkle in the darkness, a ghost fleet anchored in uncertainty. On the Iranian coast, the IRGC stands ready, their missiles pointed seaward. On the horizon, the silhouette of an American destroyer cuts through the water, its crew at battle stations. The world holds its breath, caught between the desire for peace and the inexorable logic of power. The Strait of Hormuz, the world's most important energy artery, has become its most dangerous fault line. And the only certainty is that the ground beneath our feet has shifted, and nothing will ever be the same.